In a world ravaged by the undead, survival often depended on choices, and the consequences of those choices. Lydia, the daughter of Alpha and heir to the barbaric code of the Whisperers, had once held the seeds of rebellion in her heart. In another timeline, she cast aside her mother's cruelty and sought sanctuary among strangers. But here, in this what-if world, Lydia chose differently. Here, she stayed with her mother. It had happened on the night of the Pikes, the same night Lydia had chosen not to return to her people in the main timeline. Alpha's whispers, shadowy and insistent, had cut deeper into Lydia than the biting wind that haunted the woods. Your place is with me. We survive because we are strong. Those people, those sheep, they will break you. In that pivotal moment, straddling a thin line between her budding humanity and the cold cruelty ingrained in her since birth, Lydia hadn't argued. She had seen the tears brimming in her mother's eyes, the frailty buried beneath the mask of ferocity, and it had chained her to the Whisperers once more. There would be no hilltop, no Alexandria, and for Lydia, no hope of turning her back on the monster that had made her. Under the moonlight, the Whisperers moved like ghosts between the trees. Their masks reeked of rot, their steps silent but purposeful. Lydia was among them, walking behind her mother, whose head tilted with the same predatory precision as always. The whispers of the group hummed around her, a chorus of monotone murmurs meant to mimic the dead. For Lydia, the sound had once been comforting. Now, it wrapped around her like a shroud, suffocating and heavy. Her thoughts drifted to Henry. He had been the kind of boy Lydia had never known could exist. Kind, gentle, hopeful. His gruesome demise atop the Pikes had been a warning, a lesson from Alpha. Love made you weak. Sentiment was poison. The aftermath had shattered Lydia, chipping away at the fragile rebellion that had first stirred in her at the hilltop. Alpha had noticed. You are stronger now, my little one? Alpha whispered that night as they crouched in the woods, watching a herd shuffle aimlessly in the distance. You've learned the truth of this world. Let go of what once held you back. Lydia didn't respond. Instead, she closed her eyes and nodded, pretending to agree. Alpha squeezed her shoulder, a pang of something unnameable flickering across her face before the cold indifference resurfaced. For all her mother's proclamations of strength and detachment, Lydia had glimpsed the cracks beneath the mask. But that knowledge wasn't power, it was a burden. She no longer cried herself to sleep, not because she'd healed, but because tears had become a luxury she couldn't afford. To cry in front of Alpha would be to invite punishment, either through her words or her blade. Weakness was a cardinal sin, and Lydia had learned to hide hers well. Months passed, and the war between the Whisperers and the communities grew fiercer. Alpha's tactics only escalated in cruelty. She used the herd to corral, terrorize, and slaughter, her methods merciless and efficient. She was a specter of fear that loomed over the borderlands, and with her at every turn was her daughter. The communities whispered of Lydia as a phantom, a figure in a walker mask whose true loyalties were unknown. Reality, however, was far less mythic. Each day, Lydia felt her humanity eroding under the weight of her mother's shadow. The more blood Alpha spilled, the more Lydia shrank into herself. It's for survival, Alpha would say after every atrocity. What we do is necessary. The justifications rang hollow in Lydia's ears. She no longer dared to dwell on the faces she had glimpsed in Alexandria, the warmth in Carol's eyes, the trust in Daryl's gaze. If she thought too long about them, about what might have been, despair crept in like rot. And so she hardened herself, rooted in the only life she knew. It was during a raid that it all began to unravel. Alpha had orchestrated an attack on Hilltop, a blaze of walkers and fire meant to cripple the once thriving community. Lydia had moved in the chaos like a ghost, sticking to the fringes of the battle and following her mother's orders. But then she saw them. Among the fleeing survivors was a woman she recognized, Enid, the girl who had treated Lydia with kindness, who had tried to show her humanity. Enid was helping a group of children, her face pale with fear but determined. A walker lunged at the group, and though Enid managed to cut it down, it left her exposed. Lydia's breathing quickened as she watched a whisperer, blade poised, move silently toward Enid. The echoes of Alpha's words filled her mind. Sentiment only makes you weak, and yet her feet moved of their own accord. In a moment that felt like an eternity, Lydia swept forward, throwing herself between Enid and the attacker. The knife meant for Enid skidded across Lydia's arm instead, leaving a shallow cut. Enid's eyes widened in shock behind Lydia as the whisperer hesitated. Lydia's mask had fallen off in the scuffle, revealing her pale, conflicted face. Recognizing her, the other whisperer faltered. "Leave," Lydia hissed. "Now." The man looked uncertain but ultimately backed away, slipping into the chaos. "Lydia." Enid's voice trembled, filled with disbelief. Why are you—" "Go," Lydia barked, cutting her off. "Get the kids and go." Through the cloud of smoke and carnage, Enid stared at her for a moment longer before nodding. Without another word, she scooped up a crying child and fled into the night. Lydia stood frozen, the weight of what she had just done sinking in. She had disobeyed Alpha. Again. It didn't take long for Alpha to find out. Whisperers were always watching, always listening, and this time there had been no hiding her transgression. The confrontation came hours after the battle ended, once they had regrouped. Alpha's eyes gleamed in the firelight, her mask discarded, her expression cold and unreadable. Beta loomed behind her, silent and imposing. "Do you understand what you've done?" Alpha's voice was calm, and that frightened Lydia more than anything. I made a call," Lydia stammered, her eyes darting between her mother and Beta. "It didn't change anything. The hilltops destroyed." Alpha's head tilted slightly. "It changed everything." She took a step closer, her voice low and venomous. "You've shown weakness again, Lydia. You've betrayed yourself. Betrayed me." "That's not true," Lydia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I've done everything you've asked. Enough!" Alpha's shout silenced her, sending the surrounding whisperers into uneasy murmurs. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then Alpha spoke again, her tone colder than ice. "You have always been a disappointment, always clinging to the past, to sentiment, to them." The words struck Lydia harder than any blade. Her chest ached with the weight of them, but she forced herself to meet her mother's gaze. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Maybe I'll never be like you." Alpha stared at her, a strange mix of sadness and fury flickering across her face. For a moment, Lydia thought her mother might actually cry. But then she smiled, cold, cruel, and devoid of warmth. "You won't have to worry about that," Alpha said softly, almost tenderly. "You're no longer my problem." Lydia's heart sank as Alpha nodded at Beta. The man stepped forward, drawing his knife. It gleamed in the firelight. Lydia didn't run. She didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end. But the blow never came. The sound of a gunshot split the night, followed by startled cries from the whisperers. Lydia's eyes flew open in time to see Beta stagger, clutching his shoulder. Figures emerged from the shadows. Carol, Daryl, Aaron, and others. They moved with precision, cutting down walkers and whisperers alike. "Lydia," Daryl called, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. For a moment, Lydia couldn't move. She was torn between the life she'd almost resigned herself to and the salvation she'd never thought would come. Then, as another gunshot rang out, she made her choice. She ran. Daryl grabbed her arm as she reached him, steering her toward the others. Behind her, Alpha's screams of rage echoed through the woods, a haunting sound that Lydia knew would stay with her for the rest of her life. Later, when they were safely away from the battle, Carol approached her. "You don't have to talk," she said softly, her gaze searching Lydia's face. "But you're safe now." Lydia nodded, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed into the older woman's arms. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to cry. And though the pain didn't vanish, it felt just a little lighter. For the first time, she wasn't alone. The firelight flickered across the faces of the survivors as they huddled in the hollow of an abandoned building. Night had fallen deep and stark, its silence broken only by faint walker groans in the distance. Lydia sat apart, her knees drawn to her chest. She felt the weight of it all, every choice, every lie, every death. Her torn sweater was matted with dirt and blood, her whisperer mask discarded in the mud where they had fled. It felt like shedding a second skin, and yet her chest was tight, as if it were still suffocating her. Daryl crouched down beside her. The light from a nearby lantern softened his features, but his eyes were sharp, steady. He handed her a water bottle, silent at first, as he always was. "You don't gotta go through it all right now," he finally said. "But when you're ready, we're here." Lydia turned the bottle in her hands, her fingers trembling as she cracked it open. She took a small sip, her dry throat protesting. "She's not gonna stop," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You know that, right? My mom. She'll come for me. She'll come for all of you." Daryl nodded, the faintest sigh escaping his lips. "Yeah, I know. You should have left me," she said, looking at him now. Her words came with a bitter edge, but there was no anger. "You don't understand what I've done. You don't. I let her hurt people. I let her kill them. I stood there and didn't stop her." "You didn't kill anyone," Daryl said evenly. "And you can't carry what she put on your shoulders. That's on her, not you." Lydia's heart twisted at his words. They were said with such quiet conviction, completely at odds with the whispering lies that had seeped into her mind for so long. But could she believe him? That she wasn't tainted beyond saving? That she deserved this chance? "I could have stopped her. I didn't. She had years to twist you up inside," Daryl said. "Doesn't happen overnight. Letting it all go. Trust me." His eyes flicked away for a moment, as if somewhere far off in his mind, he was looking at someone who wasn't there anymore. "What matters is what you do now." Lydia closed her eyes and leaned back against the wall, the words settling uneasily in her chest. What she did now. But what could she do now, when everything felt so shattered? All she could see when she closed her eyes was Alpha's face twisted with betrayal and rage, the firelight glinting off Beta's knife, and the blood, the constant stench of death clinging to her skin no matter how far she ran. Carol had been watching them from the shadowed corner of the room, her face unreadable. She didn't step forward. Not yet. Not until Lydia gave some sign that she could bear it. But the lines around Carol's eyes were etched deeper than Lydia remembered. Lydia hadn't spoken much to her, but she felt Carol's gaze like a weight, full of unasked questions. She had been like a storm ready to break during the rescue, ruthless and exacting as she fought her way through the whisperers. It wasn't Alpha she wanted. Not yet. It was Lydia. "You don't owe anyone anything right now," Daryl added quietly before giving Lydia's shoulder a soft nudge and heading back toward Aaron. Lydia watched him, aching in a way she couldn't describe. In another life, maybe she could have been more like them, could have been better. But now, she didn't know what she was. The exhaustion weighed heavier by the second. She closed her eyes, though the darkness felt too much like the woods she had left behind. Too much like the nights she spent sleeping beside her mother's cold, silent judgment. The silence was the trick of it. Alpha had perfected the art of never saying what you feared, she thought, letting you eat yourself alive instead. When sleep finally came, it wasn't gentle. It was a vortex of broken faces and memories turned jagged. Henry's wide, unseeing eyes stared back at her, frozen beneath moonlight. Enid's face flickered like a gasping flame, as if pleading with her. Lydia dreamed of Alpha's whisper curling around her neck like a tightening noose, always pulling her back, stronger than her own will. She awoke before dawn, her chest heaving, the phantom of Alpha's voice lingering in her ears. When the others stirred, Daryl was the first to notice her sitting upright, staring blankly into the cracked floor. He glanced toward Carol, and without a word, Carol stepped closer but still didn't sit. It was like she knew Lydia would run from pity or softness. "Walk with me," Carol said, her voice just loud enough. Lydia hesitated but felt no malice in the request. She glanced at Daryl, who gave her a slight nod, and then followed Carol into the brittle air of the early morning. The woods were different in the gray light, emptier somehow without the endless whispers that had filled every shadow. Carol walked in silence for a while until they reached a clearing. She crouched near a frost-covered log and motioned for Lydia to sit. "I just thought we could talk," Carol said quietly. She didn't look at Lydia but instead at the mist rising in thin layers over the morning frost. No walls, no expectations. Lydia sank down slowly, unsure of what to say. The words coiled inside her, tangled like the vines she used to fidget with beneath that wretched mask. "You think you don't belong here," Carol said after a long silence, her voice calm but not accusing. "You think we see you as her, as Alpha." Lydia flinched. Not physically, but something in her chest tightened sharply. Maybe it was the truth of it, or maybe it was the clarity in Carol's statement, spoken like a fact rather than a question. "I know what it feels like to carry all of it," Carol continued, her hands resting in her lap, still as stone. "The guilt, the faces you see in your head every time you close your eyes. And maybe you think you don't deserve this chance. Maybe you're waiting for the punishment you think you're owed." She finally turned her gaze to Lydia, her blue eyes piercing but soft. "But it's not coming. Not from me." Lydia stared at her, a lump rising painfully in her throat. "You're wrong," Lydia croaked, her voice trembling. "I am like her. I hated seeing it, but I didn't stop her. I let her hurt people she made me believe deserved it because they were weak. And part of me believed it. I don't—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Carol sat still for a moment before shifting closer, her movements patient. She didn't reach out, didn't force anything. "The part of you that believed her? It's the same part of you that survived," Carol said. "Holding on to the lies she fed you, it kept you alive. It doesn't make you her." Lydia's fingers curled into her tangled hair, and though the tears came sharp and fast, she didn't try to stop them. All the weight she had carried, all the shame, spilled out in gasping breaths. Slowly, Carol reached across the space between them and rested a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "She's not your mother anymore," Carol said softly. "She let you go. That was her choice. Now you get to choose. You get to fight." Lydia looked up, her cheeks streaked with tears. "I don't even know how to start." "You already did." Carol gave her a faint, tired smile, haunted but genuine. "It's never easy. It's never clean. But none of us do this on our own. You'll never have to again. You've got us." The weight in Lydia's chest didn't disappear, but something inside her shifted. It wasn't enough to tear down the suffocating walls she had built, but it was a crack, a tiny fracture where light could begin to seep through. She wiped her face on her sleeve, her breath still shaky but steadier. Carol rose, holding out a hand to her. Lydia hesitated before taking it, the older woman pulling her to her feet. Together, they walked back toward the others, the morning light chasing the shadows that still threatened to swallow her whole. There was a long road ahead, uncertain, dangerous, and full of ghosts that Lydia knew would not release her easily. Alpha would come. The past would not rest. But in those fragile, fleeting moments, Lydia felt the faintest flicker of hope. A whisper, quiet and persistent, of something she thought she had lost forever. Freedom. As the group made their slow, deliberate way back to their makeshift shelter, the fragile light of dawn lent a haunted softness to the woods. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every distant groan of a wandering walker, set Lydia's nerves on edge. Her mind replayed the confrontation with Alpha, the cold weight of her mother's final words. "You're no longer my problem." The way she had said it, tender and venomous at once. Lydia wondered if it was more of a death sentence than the knife Beta had nearly driven into her heart. Daryl walked ahead, his crossbow slung across his back as his eyes scanned their surroundings, never resting for long on one single point. Carol kept pace beside Lydia, her face hard to read, though the faint lines of worry around her mouth gave her away. Lydia had seen that look before. Survivors wore it when they thought they might have saved someone too late. It was the look of someone unsure if pulling a person from the fire had left them burned beyond recognition. They reached the shelter, a battered hollow structure that could barely pretend it had once been a house. The paint was long gone, the walls weathered to gray, but it stood, and that was enough for now. Inside, Aaron sat near a boarded-up window, reinforcing the barricades with slow, determined hammer falls, while Connie silently gestured to Kelly, cataloging their meager supplies and rationing what little food they had left. Daryl gave Lydia a sideways glance before stepping over to Aaron, leaving her standing awkwardly in the doorway, outside the tenuous orbit of the group. Carol nudged Lydia forward gently but didn't say anything. That silence should have been comforting, yet it felt unbearable. Part of Lydia itched to run again, before the others could decide what to do with her, or before her mistakes caught up with them. But Carol's voice, soft but firm, broke the silence before Lydia could persuade herself to move. "Sit down," Carol said. "Your body might be running on fight or flight, but that doesn't mean we have time for either right now. Eat something, drink something, rest." Lydia reluctantly sat, lowering herself onto the sagging remains of an old couch covered in mildew. Her body obeyed Carol, but her mind refused to relent, gnawing like a pack of wild dogs on the scraps of guilt and doubt she carried. She picked at the edges of her sleeves, pulling faint threads loose, her thoughts slipping to Alpha. To her voice, the cold assurances, the whispered promises laced with control. Alpha had always known exactly when to pull back and when to drive the blade deeper, to make Lydia reach for her approval even when it meant compromising her own soul. Now, outside that shadow, she felt hollow, unmoored, and sick with herself. "Lydia." She looked up sharply, startled by Carol's low call of her name. She hadn't realized how tightly she had twisted her sleeves until Carol's gaze flicked meaningfully toward her hands. Lydia released the fabric and pulled her arms stiffly to her sides. Carol crouched in front of her again, patient but persistent. "You're just chewing yourself up in here?" Carol said, tapping 2 fingers lightly against Lydia's temple. "It's loud, the past, the guilt. I get it. Hell, it never shuts up. But if you stay stuck here..." Her fingers tapped Lydia's head again. "Alpha wins. You hear me? She wins." Lydia's throat tightened, but she nodded. The words hit hard because they were true. Alpha didn't have to be here with her. You carried your monsters long after you left them behind. She wondered if that was why Carol's voice carried an edge of bitterness, like she knew a thing or two about monsters that stayed long after the blood should have washed clean. Hours passed in uneasy quiet. The group worked, rested, ate what little they could spare, while the tension threading the air held them all tightly coiled, ready to snap. Daryl and Aaron pored over a map on the scratched surface of a decrepit table, marking potential checkpoints along the trail northward, places where they could stash supplies or set ambushes. It was clear they weren't planning on staying in one place for long. Lydia stayed near the corner of the room, not yet part of the rhythm they all seemed to instinctively move with. As night began to bleed back into the world, the question hanging unspoken in the air finally dropped, heavy and inevitable. What happens when Alpha comes for her? Kelly's voice was soft but steady, though there was no mistaking the edge of worry sharpening her words. She glanced at Lydia, but mostly at Carol and Daryl. "What happens when she comes for us?" "She's gonna come," Lydia said flatly before either of them could respond, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. She stepped forward, her eyes darting between the group. "You know that. She's not just gonna let me walk away. This isn't over for her. It'll never be over unless..." Daryl frowned. "Unless what?" Lydia's voice wavered, but she pushed through, her hands trembling at her sides. "Unless one of us kills her." The weight of the statement seemed to pull the room into an oppressive silence. Daryl leaned back slightly, rubbing a rough palm over his face, a faint huff of frustration escaping him. Carol's face was unreadable, though Lydia caught the flicker of something. An agreement, dark and unspoken. It instantly made Lydia uneasy. Carol could have been looking at Alpha already dead in her mind. "I'm not saying this place is a damn picnic," Aaron said, keeping his tone low but firm. But we don't solve problems like that unless there's no other way. Sometimes there isn't another way, Carol finally said, her voice cutting through Aaron's measured cadence. She looked at Lydia, then at the floor for a long moment. You know that better than most? She added softly, as if speaking to herself. Lydia's stomach churned as her gaze met Carol's. There was pain in her, something permanent, carved deep. But it wasn't the same as Alpha's cold indifference. It burned instead of froze. She's not gonna stop, Lydia pressed quietly, her gaze darting back to the others. Not until she thinks there's nothing left standing. Not until she's proven to me, to herself, that I'm not worth saving. Her voice cracked at the edges, but she didn't care anymore. And all of you are in the way of her proving that. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air as Daryl leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. His demeanor was tired but thoughtful, his fingers tapping once against the edge of his crossbow. He didn't meet Lydia's eyes but fixed his gaze somewhere beyond her, focused and intent. She's right, Daryl finally admitted, his head tilting slightly toward the others in the room. Alpha ain't the type to let any of this go. We've seen the way she works, what she's willing to do to stay in control. She's not gonna stop. One way or another, we're gonna have to deal with her. Aaron sighed heavily, nodding after a brief pause. We'll need to be smart about it, though. Alpha's not invincible, but she's not stupid. She'll expect us to push back. She'll use the herd. She'll use the terrain. He glanced at Lydia briefly, his lips pressed into a grim but not unfriendly line. She'll use you if she can. I know, Lydia said softly, though the thought sent an icy jolt down her spine. Of course Alpha would. Alpha had always used her. That didn't mean she wouldn't keep doing it. As much as Lydia hated the idea of being her mother's pawn even now. The conversation drifted then, turning to strategies and regroup points, how they might thin the herd Alpha used so effectively, how they could split their group while keeping trackers watching for any Whisperer scouts. Lydia drifted back to her corner, her thoughts churning as their voices faded into a low hum of planning. Later, as the others settled into uneasy sleep, Lydia sat alone near the boarded-up window, the faint sound of walkers dragging aimlessly across gravel in the distance. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the planks, painting pale lines of light across her hands. Her mother's words clawed at her mind, digging into the raw places she could never seem to keep stitched together. Asterisk, you've betrayed yourself. Betrayed me. Always clinging to them. Always weak. Asterisk, she should have felt free, untethered from Alpha's suffocating influence. It felt like the opposite. The weight of every choice crushing her lungs with each breath. The soft creak of footsteps broke into her scattered thoughts. Lydia turned to find Carol stepping from the shadows, just close enough to see her face. You're not sleeping, Carol said, and it wasn't a question. Lydia shrugged weakly, her eyes dropping to the floor. Doesn't seem worth it. It's always the same dreams. Carol didn't ask about them. Instead, she stood beside Lydia, staring out the broken remnants of the window as if watching the same unfocused nightmare Lydia wrestled with, though her eyes remained open. They stood in silence until Carol said, "You don't have to carry it alone." The words were simple, but their weight was heavier than anything Lydia had carried before. She didn't respond, not because she dismissed them, but because they threatened to crack her open further. The night pressed on, too long and too quiet, but beneath that oppressive silence was the barest trace of something else. Something Lydia had thought she might never feel again. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the dim awareness that maybe, just maybe, she had other choices left to make. Choices not meant for surviving Alpha, but for surviving herself. Choices that weren't beat into her by whispering lies. Carol stayed until the distant horizon began graying for morning, an unspoken promise lingering between them both. Maybe there was a way forward. Maybe Lydia wasn't beyond saving.